Good morning. Welcome back to Monday Morning Activations with Val Alino and Michael Mintz. I need to let you know right up front that Val is under the weather and is not able to be here this morning. So if you would just pray over her today and think of her if you would. And so I'm going to be coming to you just me this morning without my partner. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about today. The words were feel and forgiveness. Okay. And just so you know, these are two words that I have had to learn a lot about in my lifetime. Okay. And when I say learn a lot about, number one, learning a lot about forgiveness and what it meant and what it is and what it's supposed to do and how we're supposed to use it in our lives, right? In order for us to live an amazing and successful life. Let's start by talking about a definition of forgiveness. So for me, forgiveness is an intentional decision to let go of resentment and anger. And when I say an intentional decision, it really is a choice. Letting go or being able to forgive and letting go of resentment and anger and maybe even bitterness in some cases, it's difficult to do, right? It's difficult to do at times. And I think for us today, it's important for us to talk about and discuss what is forgiveness and what is it not? Okay, because a lot of times I think we get very confused about what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. And so first I want to say that number one, forgiveness is not a feeling. It's not an emotion. It's actually a decision, right? Forgiveness is a decision to take action that affects your well-being, right? It's an act of love, right, for yourself, okay? And it's important also to know that you don't have to feel forgiving, right? You don't have to feel forgiving to be able to forgive. Next, I think it's important to know that forgiving does not mean forgetting, right? Forgiving does not mean that you have to forget, because that would be denial. And we don't need to be in denial in order to be able to forgive. Forgiving also does not mean excusing their wrong. It does not mean saying, well, it doesn't matter, because things that don't matter don't need to be forgiven, correct? So here's what forgiveness does. Forgiveness says, I know what you did. I know what you did. And it hurt me. But I'm not going to hold it against you for my sake, right? Forgiveness is something we do for us. Forgiveness is something that we bless ourselves with, right? So let's talk about what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is letting go of the right to be right. Right? It's forgiveness is offering up your anger and letting go of the desire for revenge. Now, I know revenge is kind of that's a scary word. That's a hard word to say for me even, right? But I know that for many years I held on to unforgiveness is what we hold on to, right? We hold on to unforgiveness. We make a decision not to forgive. And typically what happens is we're the one paying the price for that unforgiveness. And a lot of times I find that the other person involved is not really even know that all this is going on. They're living their life. They're doing okay. We're the one holding on to this forgiveness, holding on to this bitterness or resentment or anger. And it's us who's being affected by us holding on to this unforgiveness against someone who may or may not even know that they need to be forgiven, right? Okay. So it's also important that we don't and just so you know this morning, Forgiveness for me has been a struggle. I'm just going to be honest with you. Forgiveness for me has been a struggle, right? Letting go of the right to be right has been a struggle for me. Okay. So I want to make sure that we don't confuse forgiveness with reconciliation or restoring a relationship. Okay. Because reconciliation requires remorse, right? And forgiveness does not. Forgiveness does not. Okay. Forgiveness is not necessarily about you reconciling a relationship. Okay. Forgiveness is something that you do for you so that you can live without the pent up anger and resentment that exists as a result, right? Let me read this to you. Forgiveness removes the grip, right? Forgiveness removes the grip that resentment and anger have on us, right? We're no longer trapped by the past actions of other people, right? Here's my story if I was to share it with you this morning, okay? My story of forgiveness, the one that I held on to the longest was with my own father, right? And it's crazy, kind of a crazy story because my father was a minister, okay? And you would think that a minister would be able to say the words, I love you, to his children. But because my father grew up with a very, very hard father, his father was hard. His father was hard on him because my father was conceived out of wedlock. My grandfather, I think probably, I had to guess, felt like he had to get married. And as a result, for many years, treated my father in very difficult ways. The worst was telling him that he would never amount to anything, okay, and that he'd never be worth anything. And so my father, growing up with all of those feelings and all of that resentment that kind of builds up when your father tells you you're never going to be anything, you're not going to amount to anything, right? You're not going to be worth anything. So my dad worked really hard at trying to let go of all that, but as a result, it was very difficult for my dad to say the words, I love you. So I left home as a 18-year-old boy going to college, very bitter, very angry at my father because of his inability, I believe, to make me feel the way a son should feel, make me feel the way I felt like, I should be able to feel as a young man. So as a result, many years of anger and resentment and bitterness built up. Okay. And long story short, it wasn't until I was about 42 years old, I invited my parents over to eat at our house. And I was on the back patio and I was cooking some steaks. And for whatever reason, it just happened to work out right where it's just me and my father sitting on the patio together. And I just, for whatever reason, just had this rush of courage. And I looked over at my dad and said, Dad, let me ask you a question. Why is it that I'm 42 years old and you've never said the words, I love you, to me? He immediately lowered his head and I could see that tears started to drip down onto the patio. And after a few minutes, he looked up at me and he says these words, Mike, I was afraid that if I said it to you, you wouldn't say it back to me. So in that moment, I realized that here's two men who had been hurting for a very long time. And I had all this pent up anger and bitterness and resentment. And had I not gotten the courage to mention it to him that day, probably would have let it go on. That day, I told my dad, I forgive you for the way that for the way that I was feeling. And he asked me for forgiveness. And that day we decided going forward that every time we saw each other, we would kiss each other on the side of the cheek and say, I love you. And that was the beginning of a relationship that I'd never had with my father until the day that he died, that I had not had 42 years previous. Okay, all because I was willing to make a decision to broach the subject and to forgive him. Okay, guys, life is very, very short. And the last thing you want to do is to live your life with pent-up anger, resentment, and bitterness for whatever reason it is. And a lot of times we have the right, right? We have the right to be angry. You have the right to be bitter. You have the right to have resentment towards whatever has happened to you. But for your sake, I'm going to encourage you to forgive. A lot of times people say, well, I can't forgive them because they're not here or because they're no longer living. And the good news about that is they don't need to be. Okay, they don't need to be. You just need to speak their name and say, I forgive you. I forgive you for this. I forgive you for this. Okay? I'm telling you, one of the greatest things you're ever going to do for yourself in your life is to forgive, is to remove that burden off of you and put it in your past. Okay. You guys are amazing. I appreciate you being here every Monday at 6:30 Central Standard Time and 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. We enjoy doing it for you. Again, my partner Alino is out today, sick. If you would, keep her in your prayers. You guys are amazing. We'll see you later.